Hi, everyone. My name is Karl Steel. I'm a professor of English at Brooklyn College in the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and I'm talking to you from Brooklyn, so there may be, unfortunately, the sound of ambulances in the background. I work on medieval animals. I have two books on the topic, How to Make a Human from the University of Ohio Press, 2011, and most recently, How Not to Make a Human from the University of Minnesota, that's 2019. I'm talking today about medieval fables. I'm going to be focusing on one by the Scottish poet Robert Henryson, and then suggest some ways you might teach this material, as the poem's about springtime and also about not listening to warnings and coming to a bad end because of that. I feel like it's kind of appropriate for this particular springtime. So let me just show you my images to help you understand what I'm doing. So Henryson was born 1420s to the 1430s, died maybe in the 1490s. He's certainly dead by the early 16th century because one of his fellow poets, a guy named William Dunbar, writes to lament that Henryson is dead. He was a schoolmaster. That's what we're told about him, in a town called Dunfermline. It's an important town just north of Edinburgh. So here's a picture of the abbey of that town, where a lot of Scottish royalty are buried. And here's where Dunfermline is. Here's a much larger town of Edinburgh. Henryson is responsible for about 5,000 lines of poetry, most famously his Testament of Cressid, which is a kind of fan fiction version of Chaucer's Troilus and Cressid, and also his fables, among other works. Now, the fables are extremely ancient, is a genre of literature that's typically about animals talking, where the animals represent various abstract virtues or vices or characteristics. Wolves are always ravenous or tyrannous. Lions tend to be noble. Sheep are always meek. Frogs are always crafty. Foxes are very, very crafty. And then they either have a promethium or an epimythium, some kind of moral that explains how we're supposed to understand this. It's a promethium. It's at the beginning of the work, and epimythium if it comes after. They're attributed in their earliest forms to Aesop, although you can find fables, in the Bible. There's one in the Bible between Nathan that's offered to David, I believe, or to Saul. There's also one in Hesiod's Works and Days. So here's the fable we're going to be working on today. It's called Swallow and the Other Birds, and here's in the form attributed to Aesop. It's about some birds who are warned by a swallow that the farmer is planting flaxseed, and that flaxseed is going to be grown and woven into nets that are going to be used to capture the birds. So the swallow is telling the other birds, you need to eat this seed before it grows up, or when it starts to sprout, you need to eat the plants, but you need to stop this somehow, because otherwise you're all going to die. And the birds just listen, and they make fun of the swallow, and the swallow finally gives up and decides to go over to humans and just make his nests in humans' houses. And the swallows, of course, end up being trapped and eaten. And the lesson of this is fairly clear, right? If you don't listen to good advice, you're a fool, and you're probably going to die. Now, nearly every educated person in the Middle Ages would have been familiar with this and other fables because they were a fundamental tool of it in education. The Roman orator Quintilian says that school children should learn to paraphrase the fables of Aesop. They should be able to condense them, expand them, write them in easy vocabulary, write them in really expansive, difficult vocabulary, write them in verse, write them in prose. They should be able to do it all kind of different ways. And so every educated person just about not only knew fables, but they learned how to write literature by writing their own versions of fables. Learning about fables is fundamental to understanding the forms of medieval literature. So here's a version by the French poet, or French writing poet, Marie de France, who worked probably in England in the 12th century. And so in her version, Swallow and the Linseed, which I offer here both in its original Old French and then a translation by Mary Lou Martin from 1984, we have again Swallow trying to warn the birds. In this version, the little birds don't want to do it. And so they go to the farmer to report the advice that the swallow had given them. That is, they denounce the swallow, and the swallow is so angry that the swallow decides to basically ally itself with humans. And the little birds, again, don't listen, and they're trapped by the nets when the farmer's crop comes to harvest. So again, we have in Marie an expanded version of the fable, and we have also this kind of political orientation, which we find so often in the fables of Marie de France. So that's a nice example. Then what I want to offer here are 4 slides, which will give you a sense of the work of Robert Henryson. This is on here from the Teens Middle English series of texts, which are available both in relatively inexpensive print editions, but also online. So you can teach it either from print or from linking to it online. They're really wonderfully annotated to help teach people learn how to read the languages. So I've got that in the original Middle Scots, which is a language that was used in lowland Scotland from roughly 1450 to roughly 1700. And we also have a translation here, which I've linked to in a form you can check out from archive.org. It's a good translation into modern English. And so here is a little bit of Henryson's opening. Henryson's version of the fable is really, really long. He's got this really nice springtime opening that follows a kind of meta commentary on how fables are supposed to work. And then we have the fable itself, and then a very long moral. And so here we have this discussion about why we need fables. I'm going to read this in an approximation of the Middle Scots, although I don't think my pronunciation is that good. So reading from here, therefore our soul, with sensualité, so federate is in présent corporal, we may not clearly understand nor say God as he is, a thing celestial, ur murk and deadly corpse material, blind is the spiritual apparition, leak than man, verbunden in prison. So we need to understand God through fables because we can't understand things except through our bodies. Basically, we need animal stories to understand God because we are more like animals than we are like God. We're bodily creatures. So that's quite interesting in itself. And then here's an excerpt from another section of the fable, which we get this really long springtime opening where you get a very strong sense of a Scottish winter. It's really quite severe. It opens up into a beautiful spring. And then we get one of Henryson's key innovations, which is the introduction of an observer. There's a witness to what's happening, who is, I think, meant to be Henryson himself. So we have basically, Henryson says, so I'm going to read from the translation just this time. I walked out towards the wood to see the flowers springing up and to hear the thrushes sing and other birds as well. I walked out and looked all about to see the soil ready for the season, fertile, prepared to nurture all the seeds. So here he is. He's actually going to watch the fable as it develops. I can't think of any other fable where that actually happens. That's really interesting. He's a witness. He's not going to be able to basically interrupt the action, and he's just going to watch helplessly as it happens. And what he eventually sees is this terrible violence, which again, you don't see represented in other versions of the fable. When the small birds are finally captured, they're beaten to death. It's really quite horrible. And I'll read the Scots again, not in a perfect accent, but to give you a sense of how it works from here. Alas, 'twas reach great hertes certe say, the bloody butcher bet des birds doom, and for till their queen they wist well today the careful song and lamentation. Some with an staff he struck the earth on swoon, some off the head, of some he broke the crag, some half on lee he stopped in his bag. So some he clubbed unconscious to the earth, he beat the head of some, he broke the neck of others, and some he stuffed into his bag, half dead. And Henryson is witnessing all this, helpless. He can't stop any of it from happening. He's sort of like the swallow, and sort of like us, and sort of like the poet who's bound to tell this story no matter what, because you can't ever change the ending of a fable. They all go the same way. And then finally, we get the moral to the story, which where the farmer is, of course, like the devil. He's the fiend who fell from his angel-like state. And the swallows are sort of like us. We're the soul that doesn't want to listen to good advice. And then, of course, the swallow is the preacher, the person who's trying to stop us from falling into this great danger. It's a very long moral. It's kind of standard, but it gives you a sense of how the fables might have been used in the pulpit by preachers. So they're not just for children. They can be used for adults to impart moral lessons in a sermon. So the manuscript context is really interesting, I think, for this particular fable. So here's one illustration of this fable from a different writer, from Julien Machaut, who's a French writer. He's translating it into prose, actually from German. And this is from a manuscript which you can access through Gallica, the website for the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And there's a link to that on the website. We begin with a Prometheum, saying basically this is for people who don't listen to good counsel. And then we have the title of the fable right here. And then here's the farmer. Here's the plowed field. Here's the bag of linseed. Here is the swallow. And here are the birds listening to the sermon, which they are going to ignore. It's a very straightforward illustration of the main parts of the fable. And then here is a manuscript that's in the British Library in London, Harley 3865. It's the illustration, as it says right here, of the preaching of the swallow. And this is really, really an unusual illustration. First off, it's unusual because of the date. It's produced in the late 16th century. We know that because it's a copy of a printed book, which I'm going to show you in the next slide. But we also have the swallow represented here as an actual human preacher. Here are the birds in the tree listening to the preacher. And here's what happens when you don't listen to the preacher. You get captured. Here's the farmer's hand holding on to a dead or helpless bird. And then down here under this bush is what I think is probably Henryson himself watching the action helplessly. I can't think of any other illustration of a fable that's anything like this. If it was based on a woodcut in a printed book, that woodcut's now lost. We don't have it anymore, unfortunately. Then here is the book that manuscript is probably based on. It's Thomas Bassandine's 1571 book, The Moral Fables based off the Phrygian, which are attributed to Robert Henryson. And it's printed here in a Roman font, the preaching of the swallow, and then in another typeface, which is called Civilité, so called because it was for a work by Erasmus, which is about how boys should become civilized. And it's based on a French handwriting form that's called lettres courantes, running letters. So this is basically trying to imitate handwriting of a particular sort. And then you see in the manuscript, here is a copy of this typeface, which is trying to imitate handwriting. So it's sort of, like a game of telephone almost. But they do a pretty good job. And that's an interesting thing to think about, just about early print and manuscripts. Then finally, in my last slide, I want to point out something in this 1571 printed book where the book uses a Roman typeface for the table of contents and also for the morals for the text. So all the most authoritative material is no longer in the Civilité font, which is a typeface, which is really a typeface for children, but rather in this very grown-up typeface, which is Roman typeface. But then in the Harley manuscript, which is copying this book, we have not really imitated that Roman typeface. There's a little bit of kind of Gothic here at the top, looks like, and then it maintains that Civilité, aka lettres courantes script here, which is interesting. So if you are teaching this work, there's a couple different ways I think you can go at this. One is you could talk about the variations between the fables. You see in the Aesop version to the Marie version to the Henryson, really quite a lot of variety. There's a baseline story, but the way that these writers all approach the story is really quite interestingly different. Those variations are certainly something you can, if your students, talk about. You can also talk about the artistic context. Those two different images, I think, are definitely worth comparing. And what does it mean just to have a very kind of straightforward snapshot of the action of the fable versus this other version where you get the swallow represented as a human preacher. You have Henryson there, who's actually there in it, but as a kind of hidden, skulking witness, along with the farmer's hand. That's really unusual and interesting. And finally, you might talk about the print manuscript context, the different typefaces that are being used and what those say about how authority and teaching works in the fables. So that's also quite interesting. But you could also even do some creative work and have students write their own versions of the fables. Basically, medieval students did this all the time. They rewrote the fables, as I said, in sometimes elevated language, sometimes simple language, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in prose. Why not have your students do that as well? You can even have them illustrate it. I think that'd be really quite fun. And finally, if you look at the bottom of the page where I'm doing this online, there's I've got links to a few samples of scholarship, both very straightforward studies of medieval narrative that's about animals, work by Jill Mann, for example, and also stuff that's more theoretically advanced, some of my own work on medieval posthumanism and critical animal theory. So if you're teaching this to advanced undergraduates or to graduate students, that's the kind of thing you can have them look at. So thanks for joining me today. This has been a lot of fun. Bye-bye.